In a small Texas town one spring evening, a man, desperate for a way out, decided to rob a store. But when Johnny Depp unexpectedly stepped in, it became the biggest regret of his life. What he did will leave you shocked. It was a quiet evening in a small town in Texas. The convenience store sat on the corner of a quiet street. A middle-aged cashier, tired but polite, stood behind the counter, ringing up items for a young couple. The door jingled as it swung open. A man walked in wearing a black hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He kept his head down, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his hoodie. This was Robert, a man pushed to the edge. He wasn't proud of what he was about to do, but he felt cornered. Bills had piled up, and no matter how hard he worked, the debt collectors wouldn't stop calling. He had convinced himself this was his only way out. Robert stopped near the candy aisle, took a deep breath, and glanced around the store. There were 4 people inside besides him: the cashier, the couple at the counter, and a man in the corner aisle, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses. Robert didn't pay much attention to him. His heart pounded as he pulled a small pistol from his pocket. It wasn't loaded. He didn't want to hurt anyone, but he knew it looked real enough to scare people. Robert walked up to the counter and pointed the gun at the cashier. "Empty the register," he commanded, his voice shaking but firm. The young couple froze, their faces pale. The cashier's hands trembled as he raised them. "Please don't hurt anyone," the man stammered. He began fumbling with the register, trying to open it. "Faster!" Robert snapped, waving the gun. The couple whispered to each other before the woman reached for her phone. Robert noticed and barked, "Don't even think about it!" She dropped the phone, her hands trembling. Robert's breathing quickened as the panic in the room grew. His eyes darted around, checking for anyone who might try to stop him. That was when he noticed the man in the corner aisle. He was still standing there, casually holding a bag of chips, seemingly unbothered by what was happening. Robert frowned. "Hey, you!" he shouted, pointing the gun at the man. "Stay where you are!" The man slowly turned his head, lowering his sunglasses to reveal a familiar face. Robert's jaw tightened, but his mind was too focused on the robbery to connect the dots. The man raised an eyebrow and smiled slightly. "Well," he said in a calm, smooth voice, "this is unexpected." Robert kept his gun aimed at the man in the hat, his frustration growing. Why wasn't this guy panicking like everyone else? The cashier was sweating buckets, and the couple was frozen in fear. But this man acted like he didn't have a care in the world. The man stepped out of the aisle slowly, his boots clicking softly against the tile floor. He held up the bag of chips in one hand, his other hand resting lazily on his belt. His face, though partially shadowed by the brim of his hat, was unmistakable. It was Johnny Depp. Robert squinted, his mind racing. The face looked familiar, but he couldn't place it. All he cared about was that this man didn't seem afraid, and that was a problem. Johnny walked closer to the counter, his movements calm and deliberate, as if he were stepping onto a film set rather than a robbery. The cashier glanced at him nervously, unsure if this stranger was going to help or make things worse. Robert barked at Johnny to back off, but he didn't raise his voice too much. He didn't want to draw attention from outside. The last thing he needed was someone calling the police. Johnny stopped a few feet away, leaning casually against the counter. His face showed no fear, just mild curiosity. His silence was unnerving. Robert felt his grip on the situation slipping. He didn't have time for this. He motioned for the cashier to hurry up with the money. The cashier's hands shook as he stuffed crumpled bills into a plastic bag. Johnny finally spoke, his voice smooth and steady. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the tension in the air like a knife. He didn't ask any questions or plead for Robert to stop. Instead, he made a casual remark about the weather outside, as if he were chatting with an old friend. Robert's face twisted in confusion. He told Johnny to keep quiet and stay out of it, but Johnny didn't move. His presence wasn't threatening, but it wasn't passive either. He seemed to be waiting for something. The couple, still pressed against the wall, watched the scene unfold, their eyes darting between Robert and Johnny. The tension in the room was thick, but Johnny's calm demeanor made it feel like time had slowed down. Robert tried to focus. He had to get the money and get out before this man caused any more distractions. Johnny reached into his pocket. For a moment, Robert's heart skipped. Was this guy armed? Was he about to pull something? Instead, Johnny pulled out a small keychain with a strange trinket on it. He fiddled with it absent-mindedly, almost like he was bored. The silence stretched on, and for the first time, Robert felt a flicker of doubt. Robert's hand tightened around the gun. His voice, already shaky, came out louder than he intended as he told Johnny to stay back. Johnny didn't flinch. Instead, he gave the smallest shrug and casually leaned on the counter. The cashier froze mid-motion, unsure whether to finish handing over the bag of cash or to wait for whatever Johnny was about to do. Robert's nerves failed with each passing second. The situation was getting out of his control. He didn't know who this man thought he was, but his calm attitude was throwing him off. It was like Johnny wasn't afraid of him or the gun. Robert snapped, pointing the gun directly at Johnny now. Johnny straightened up, his expression neutral. "You're sweating," he said in a low, almost conversational tone. Robert blinked, unsure how to respond. Johnny gestured lightly toward Robert's trembling hands. "You don't want to do this. Whatever brought you here tonight, there's still a way to fix it." Robert's stomach churned. He didn't need a lecture. Not now. He spat out a harsh response, but his words didn't carry much weight. Johnny tilted his head slightly, studying Robert like he was an actor auditioning for a role. "What's the plan then?" he asked. "You grab the cash and… what? Run out into the storm? Get caught 2 blocks away because someone called the cops the moment you walked in?" Robert felt heat rising in his face. His plan had been simple: in and out, no complications. But Johnny's words made him feel small, like a child caught doing something foolish. The couple huddled closer together, their breaths barely audible. The cashier kept his head down, clutching the bag of cash, but making no move to hand it over. Johnny stepped a little closer, his boots clicking softly. Robert jerked the gun upward, warning him to stay back. "Relax," Johnny said, holding his hands up in mock surrender. His tone was calm, almost playful, but his eyes were sharp. Robert felt something shift in the room. Johnny's presence was commanding without being aggressive. It was like he had taken control of the situation without Robert even realizing it. The gun in Robert's hand suddenly felt heavier, less like a tool of power, and more like a useless prop. His mind raced. He couldn't back down. Not now. But for the first time, doubt crept in. Johnny's gaze softened, but his words carried weight. "You've already made a mistake coming here. Don't make it worse. Put the gun down, walk out, and try again tomorrow. Whatever you're running from, this isn't the way." Robert's chest tightened. His grip on the gun loosened slightly. He glanced around the store, the frightened couple, the pale cashier, the quiet aisles. Everything seemed frozen, waiting for his next move. Johnny didn't press further. He stood there, steady and calm, giving Robert space to decide. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to say something, but no words came. His mind felt tangled, his desperation at odds with the growing sense that Johnny was right. Then, a sharp wail of sirens broke through the silence. Faint, but unmistakable. Someone had called the police after all. Robert froze. Johnny didn't flinch. "Clock's ticking," he said simply. Robert's pulse thundered in his ears. His hands shook as he looked down at the gun, then back at Johnny. The sirens grew louder, the sound slicing through Robert's panic like a blade. His breath came in shallow bursts, and sweat dripped down his temple. He knew he didn't have much time. Johnny remained where he was, calm and unyielding. The weight of his presence seemed to push Robert into a corner he couldn't escape. The gun in his hand felt like a dead weight now, more of a burden than a tool. His mind raced. He thought about the bills piling up at home, the endless calls from debt collectors, the shame of failing his family. He had told himself that this was his only option. But now, standing in this tiny store with Johnny Depp staring him down, that justification felt thin. The cashier slowly raised the bag of cash toward Robert, his hands trembling. For a brief moment, he reached for it, but Johnny's voice stopped him cold. "That bag won't fix what's broken," Johnny said softly. Robert froze, his hands suspended in the air. Johnny didn't move closer, but his words cut through the tension like a knife. "You'll take it, sure. Maybe you'll even get away. But the hole you're in, it'll still be there tomorrow. Bigger, deeper." Robert's throat tightened. He looked down at the cashier, who was staring up at him with wide, fearful eyes. His gaze shifted to the couple, still huddled together by the wall, and finally back to Johnny, whose expression held no fear, only quiet resolve. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what he was doing. This wasn't just about him. These people would remember his face, his voice. He wasn't just robbing a store, he was scaring strangers. The sirens were close now, probably just a block or two away. There was no time left to think. Robert's hand dropped to his side, the gun hanging limply in his grip. His shoulders slumped, as if all the fight had drained out of him at once. The cashier blinked in surprise, unsure what to do. Johnny took a small step forward, his eyes never leaving Robert's. Slowly, deliberately, Robert set the gun on the counter. "I'm done," he muttered, barely audible. The couple let out a collective sigh of relief. The cashier stepped back, clutching the bag of cash to his chest. Johnny nodded, his face still calm, but now tinged with something softer, understanding, maybe even compassion. He didn't say anything else, just gestured toward the door. Robert hesitated, his feet rooted to the ground. The sirens were right outside now, flashing lights spilling through the windows. He knew what was coming, but for the first time, He wasn't running. Two police officers burst through the door, guns drawn. They shouted commands, but Robert didn't resist. He raised his hand slowly, letting them cuff him and lead him outside. As he was escorted to the waiting squad car, he glanced back at the store. Johnny stood near the counter, watching him with an unreadable expression. Nathan felt a strange pang of regret, not just for the crime, but for the man he had been before he walked into that store. As the officers led Robert toward the door, his head hung low, but he hesitated just before stepping outside. He turned back to look at Johnny, his eyes clouded with shame and something deeper, gratitude maybe. Johnny didn't move from where he stood by the counter. His face remained calm, but there was a flicker of understanding in his gaze. Robert swallowed hard, his voice hoarse. "Why'd you do it?" Johnny tilted his head slightly, his hand still resting on the counter. "Do what?" Robert shifted uncomfortably in his cuffs. "You could have stopped me earlier. Could have called the cops yourself. But you didn't." Johnny considered this for a moment before replying. "Figured you needed a chance to stop yourself first." The words hit Robert harder than he expected. He looked down at the ground, nodding slightly, as if he finally understood. One of the officers gave Nathan a light push toward the door, but before he stepped out, he glanced back one last time. "Thanks," he muttered, barely audible. Johnny didn't reply immediately. He simply gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. As the door closed behind Robert, the room fell into an uneasy silence. The couple and the cashier looked at Johnny, their faces a mix of relief and awe. Johnny picked up the bag of chips he had left on the counter earlier, tossed a few bills onto the counter, and walked toward the door. Before stepping outside, he turned to the cashier and gave a small smile. "Keep the change." With that, Johnny disappeared into the night, leaving the store eerily quiet, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. Robert sat in the back of the police car, staring out the window at the rain-slicked streets of the small Texas town. His wrists ached from the cuffs, but the pain was nothing compared to the heavy knot in his chest. The adrenaline that had fueled him earlier was gone, leaving only a deep, raw regret. The image of Johnny Depp's calm face lingered in his mind. The man had looked at him not with fear, but with something else, more of understanding, maybe even pity. Robert couldn't shake the words Johnny had said to him. Quiet but powerful. "You needed a chance to stop yourself." At the station, the officers processed him with mechanical efficiency. Robert barely said a word, his mind replaying the events at the store. As he sat in a holding cell, the faint sounds of other detainees around him, he stared at the wall and thought about his life. What had brought him to this moment? He wasn't a bad person, at least. He hadn't thought so. But the weight of unpaid bills, the shame of not being able to provide, and the endless pressure had twisted his judgment until this terrible choice seemed like his only way out. He thought about the people in the store, the young couple, clutching each other in fear, the cashier, trembling as he handed over the money. They hadn't deserved that. Robert closed his eyes, the guilt washing over him like a tide. Then there was Johnny. Why had he stepped in? He hadn't fought back or tried to play the hero. He had just stood there, steady and calm, speaking words that had cut deeper than anything Robert could remember. The door to the holding cell opened, and a guard handed Robert a small slip of paper. It was his booking number, along with the charges against him. He took it silently, his fingers trembling as he folded it and slipped it into his pocket. The next morning, Robert was allowed a phone call. He hesitated for a long time before dialing. When the voice on the other end answered, he choked back the lump in his throat. "It's me," he said quietly. "I messed up. Bad." There was silence on the line before the voice. A woman's voice responded softly. "We'll figure it out, one step at a time." Robert hung up and leaned back in his chair. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt a faint flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could fix what he had broken. A few days later, Robert's name appeared in the local paper's crime section, a brief write-up about the failed robbery. Toward the bottom of the article, there was a curious mention of an unidentified witness who had managed the situation. At a coffee shop across town, Johnny Depp sipped his drink, flipping casually through the paper. When he reached the article, he smiled faintly, shook his head, and folded the paper neatly. He left a generous tip on the table before heading out, his hat tilted low as he disappeared into the crowd. Months passed. Robert's life became a blur of court dates, public apologies, and time spent behind bars. He had been sentenced to a short jail term, thanks to his lack of a criminal record, and the fact that no one had been hurt. But the hardest part wasn't the jail time, it was facing what he had become. On one of those days, as he sat in the jail's common area, the guard called his name. "Visitor for you," the guard said, jerking his thumb toward the visitation room. Robert frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. His family hadn't visited since his arrest. They were too hurt, too disappointed. As he walked into the room, his heart pounded. Sitting on the other side of the glass was Johnny Depp. Robert froze. For a moment, he thought it had to be some kind of mistake, but Johnny gave him a small nod. gesturing for him to sit. He slid into the chair, picking up the phone awkwardly. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Johnny leaned forward, his expression calm but firm. "To see how you're holding up," he said. Robert blinked, unsure how to respond. "Why do you care?" Johnny's gaze didn't waver. "Because I've been where you are. Not exactly, but close enough. Made my share of mistakes. Took a while to figure out how to climb out of the hole I had dug for myself." Robert's throat tightened. He wanted to argue, to say that a man like Johnny Depp couldn't possibly understand his life. But there was something in Johnny's eyes, an honesty that Robert couldn't ignore. Johnny leaned back in his chair. "When you get out of here, you'll have a choice to make. You can keep running from your problems, or you can face them head on. I figured you might need someone to remind you of that." Robert nodded slowly, his chest heavy with emotion. He didn't know what to say, so he simply muttered, "Thanks." Johnny slid a small envelope across the table to the guard, who handed it to Robert. Inside was a note with an address and a short message that reads, "When you're ready to start over, come find me." Robert stared at the note, his mind spinning. He looked up to thank Johnny, but the man was already gone, leaving behind nothing but the faint scent of cologne and a lingering sense of hope. When Robert was finally released, he had nothing but the clothes on his back and the crumpled note Johnny had given him. For days, he debated whether to use it. What if it was just a gesture? Something Johnny hadn't meant literally. But one morning, with no other options and no pride left to lose, he showed up at the address. It wasn't what he expected. It wasn't a fancy studio or a private mansion. It was a small community center on the outskirts of town. Inside, a group of people sat in a circle, sharing stories of struggles, mistakes, and second chances. And there, sitting quietly in the back, was Johnny. Johnny gave him a small nod, gesturing for him to join. Robert hesitated, then stepped forward, his heart pounding, but his steps steady. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, could find his way again.